Consciousness is something like an error detection and rectification system, something like that. And so you can say, well, you could practice being conscious, because what that means in some sense is you're always attending to your errors. And that seems to be a really intelligent thing to do if you don't take it too far and collapse yourself. Because if you're always attending to your errors, you're always improving your automated adaptability. Something like that, right? Pay attention. See if things are working out the way that you want them to. And if they're not, modify your approach, your perceptions. Okay, so you've conserved these systems. And the systems emerge to solve the problems of emergent complexity. And you end up at birth with all of these conserved systems. And so those would be proclivities that would enable you to manifest the necessary realm of behaviors in the social, natural, human environment. Something like that. So you're basically prepared for that. And we went through what those were last time, and you can break them down into self-maintenance motivations and self-propagation motivations, something like that. So, okay, now the question is, how do those manifest themselves? And that's where we can make a shift, say, from evolutionary ideas and biological ideas to narrative ideas. So I've made the case for you that you exist within this thing. I've never figured out exactly what to call it, because you can call it a game, or you can call it a frame of reference, which is a pretty good one, or you can call it a story, or you can call it a unit of perception, but that's not exactly right, because it's more than perception. It's really this, what it is a micro-personality. It's your personality as it manifests itself at the highest possible resolution. That's what this is. And so if I'm, say I set myself the task of moving those keys from there to here. So my perceptual frame it's this thing. I think, well, what's the world? Everything else can be ignored. I need to make an object out of my hand, these keys, that tiny spot on the table. And my goal is to transform this pattern into that pattern. And it's a pattern because it maintains itself across time, right? It's not like smoke or a cloud, it persists. So there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. That's a pattern that's extending across time. So I have this goal, which is the transformation of this into that. And that goal, so that would be, roughly speaking, the goal is point B. But you can't just think about this as something that's a goal, because it isn't just a goal. There's a goal, which is the end state of this entire process. The end state is, I've moved the thing from here to here, I've transformed this into this, and I've done it using action. And so that's a useful thing to know too. I have an abstract notion, that's my decision, that I'm going to get the world to manifest this pattern instead of this one. Okay, so that gives me my target. That's an abstraction. But when I actually do the transformation, that's not an abstraction, because now I'm using actual action, actual behavior. And so I take this abstract micro-personality, this is the part that's operating on this tiny little section of the world, I make the transformation, and as soon as I do that, another thing happens, which is I don't need that anymore, right? I move to the next one of those, whatever it happens to be. And so one of the things we're going to have to figure out is, what is the relationship between these things? Because you're always in one of them, and they're scalable. It's like when you're doing a specific action, it's really high resolution, and that's kind of where you want to be operating. When you know what you're doing, that's where you want to be operating, roughly speaking, when you're trying to do something new. But it's scalable. And so the framework, which is constructed in part from these motivational systems that emerged over evolutionary history, the framework specifies the current condition, the desired condition, and the behavioral manifestations that are necessary to make the transformation. And so you can't think about it as a drive, because instincts are often thought about as drives, or as a goal. It's not correct, because the thing actually determines your perceptions. It determines what objects manifest themselves to you in the world, or what patterns. That's another way of thinking about it. Because like when I'm looking at this, it's hard to watch your own perceptions. But when I'm looking at this, I can see that chair, but if I didn't know it was a chair, I wouldn't be able to tell by looking by my visual input. I can kind of see this one, although I really can't tell what color it is. That one's slightly clearer. This is pretty blurry here. Like I can't see my fingers if I'm looking at the keys. I can't see my fingers unless they move. And I'm very, very focused on that. So what happens is that all the rest of the world turns into a low resolution representation that vanishes on its periphery. The resolution increases as I move towards the central part of my visual field, and here it's sharp enough so that I can actually see the letters on that key. So my desire, which I'm indicating by the point of my eyes, is specifying the objects that I see and specifying their level of resolution. So you can't just call that a drive or a goal. That's not right. It's the mechanism that makes the world manifest itself to you. So that's a unbelievably crazy thing, is that the world manifests itself to you in keeping with your goals. Now that doesn't mean that you can make the world do any old thing, because it pushes back, right? It objects to you. So, but still, it's a very strange thing. That. Okay, so fine, so it specifies your perceptions, your target, the current reality, and the likely procedure that you're going to use to make all of that interrelated. But it does more than that. So we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So the classic and archaic way of thinking about perception is the world's full of objects, you see the objects, you think about them, you evaluate them, then you act on them. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. First of all, the world is not made out of objects. The world is made out of, I think the world is made out of tools and obstacles. And it's because you can't not perceive the world in relationship to you. What you perceive actually are the meaning of objects. You perceive the patterns. A tool is something like a meaningful pattern or a useful pattern. It's something like that. And so look, again, you look at, I might say to someone, describe this room. Now you're going to pick a level of description that's very particular. You're going to pick one that other human beings could understand. So it's going to be predicated on your size, for example. And it's going to be predicated on your knowledge that that other person is a lot like you and has a lot of the same underlying structures and motivations. So, and that's an implicit predicate of your description. So we're going to say, well, it's kind of an ordinary classroom. It's got 20 rows of tables that each have 5 chairs at it, and each of them has 5 chairs. There's some posts that hold them up. There's a couple of speakers, there's a podium, there's a screen, there's some additional chairs, there's a scattering of people, there's some electronic equipment. And so, you know, of course, that there's an infinite number of things I could be describing in this room, right? Like I could be describing, there's a lot of color variation in that tile. So if I look at it, I can see that it's unlike the other tiles because the light is reflecting off it. So it's got a shiny white element. There's about, God only knows, 1 million different scratches in it, each of which are unique. I can't even really tell what color it is. It kind of looks like an off grayish green. But if I was painting it, to get a reasonable representation, I'd have to have at least 6 or 7 shades of green, ranging from quite dark to almost white. And that's only if I look at it from here. If I look at it from here, well then you get the point, right? I mean, there is an infinite number of details in this room. There's an infinite number of facts in this room. That's also why I don't believe that you can derive an ought from an is. It's like, you know, that's the old Humean issue, right? You cannot derive ethical guidelines from factual knowledge. And I think the reason for that is, which facts are you going to pick? How are you going to select them? There's an infinite number of them, even in a constrained situation. So, merely by attending to some and not attending to others, you're already using an ethic, because you can't attend to one thing and not another without being ensconced in one of these value structures, because the value structure is what determines the direction of your attention. And so you can't make the argument that you're using the infinite number of facts that are available at your disposal to govern how you're looking at the facts. You're not. That isn't what you're doing. It's not possible to do that. So what do? Well, you describe the things in the room that would be relevant to other people. Otherwise you're going to bore them to death, or they're going to think you're insane. You know, so, or an artist maybe, because an artist might do the kind of concentration on a detail that I just described, but he's obviously, or she's obviously trying to paint the thing or represent it somehow. So it's still tool-like. Well, why do you want to know that there are tables? Well, because you sit at them. Why do you want to know if there are chairs? Because you sit in them. You know, what about the screen or the camera equipment? Well, they're all usable tools. And so that's what you describe. You describe the world at the level of usable tool. Or you might also say, you know, look out for that girl who's in the third row. She's trouble. And so you might call out someone if you're describing the room, because there's somewhere in that room that if you go, you're going to get into trouble. And so those are sort of the things that seem to me to be relevant. There are tools that move you along your way, facilitators, that's another way of thinking about them, and there are obstacles that get in your way. And there's a tiny set of those, otherwise you get overwhelmed. You're not going to go anywhere where it's all obstacles, right? You don't even want, you don't want to be in that place. You want to be in a place where it's mostly this. And then there's the biggest category though, this is what's cool, this is so important, is the biggest perceptual category is that which is not relevant at this time. Because it contains everything. You know, like when you're writing on this pad, you assume the entire world around you is constant, and therefore you can ignore it. It's everything out there. All the transformations that are taking place, you turn to zero. And you just focus on maybe the space that's occupied by a single letter. Your whole world shrinks down to just that single letter, and everything else is ignored. Well, what happens if something goes wrong? This is the thing, this is why this is so important. What happens if something goes wrong? An indeterminate set of those irrelevant entities has now become relevant. That's the problem, is the invisibility disappears. And so, for example,